December 21, 1944. The Texas wind cut across the plain like a cold blade. Under a slate sky, the chain-link fence of Camp Hearn shimmered with hoarfrost. Each strand of barbed wire caught the weak light and turned it into a thin, glittering knife. In that pale hush, a single hand pushed something small and heavy through the metal. A blanket, folded, warm from a soldier's shoulder. It slid across cold fingers and into a lap that had known too many winters. This is the story of that blanket, of the soldier who let it go, and of the women who carried it afterward in memory. An ordinary, unexpected act of mercy whose echo would cross oceans and decades. Stay with this moment. What seems minor at first will come to mean far more than its size. If this story matters to you, like and subscribe. Help keep these quiet pieces of history alive. They arrived in the dark between December nights. A truck full of women prisoners pulled into the yard. The camp was used to movement. Men from Europe, crews of Axis prisoners arriving by the dozens. But this arrival had a different look. Faces that belonged to home kitchens and classrooms rather than battlefields. Nurses, typists, some described simply as wives or clerks. They stepped down from the truck carrying what little they had. Shoulders wrapped in coats improvised for travel, eyes bright with that strange mix of fear and relief that comes when one first realizes a long journey has ended. The barracks smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and the stubborn tang of disinfectant. Men in olive drab moved with the practiced efficiency of military routine. Count, catalog, assign bunks. Guards clipped pieces of paper to pockets, recorded names. A nurse in the compound called out the medical checks. A lieutenant scribbled into a log. There were rules here. Rules about distance, about forms, about what a guard could say and what he must not. Yet the human body learns its own language quicker than law. Frost bit at ears. Fingers went numb within minutes. Breath came out in white puffs. Camp Hearn sat inland, away from the headlines and the front. By the winter of 1944, the European war had been raging for 5 long years. News filtered unevenly to these fenced grounds. American policy, Geneva obligations, the presence of the Red Cross, all these shaped the way prisoners were housed and fed. But at ground level, beyond memos and regulations, life simplified to essentials: heat, clean water, bread, a blanket when the nights turned to glass. Inside the women's barracks, the atmosphere was taut and low. They were strangers to one another in this place, yet names came quickly. Elise, Hilda, Greta, Margot, Clara, names carried like talismans. Stories ran in low threads across bunks. Who had last seen home? Who had been a nurse on a hospital ward? Who had no family left? Some wrapped their thin hands around mugs to coax warmth. Camp Hearn sat inland, away from the headlines and the front. By the winter of 1944, the European war had been raging for 5 long years. News filtered unevenly to these fenced grounds. American policy, Geneva obligations, the presence of the Red Cross, all these shaped the way prisoners were housed and fed. But at ground level, beyond memos and regulations, life simplified to essentials: heat, clean water, bread, a blanket when the nights turned to glass. Inside the women's barracks, the atmosphere was taut and low. They were strangers to one another in this place, yet names came quickly. Elise, Hilda, Greta, Margot, Clara, names carried like talismans. Stories ran in low threads across bunks. Who had last seen home? Who had been a nurse on a hospital ward? Who had no family left? Some wrapped their thin hands around mugs to coax warmth. Some sat in stillness, watching the wire where men in uniforms passed outside like constant, anonymous weather. Elise kept her hands tucked under her thighs. She was slight, in her mid-20s by later accounts, what one record would call a typist, another a teacher. She had the way of people who measure words carefully. There was a steadiness to her that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with keeping a small, private order when the world had fallen apart. When she noticed a pocket of cold that would not leave, she folded into it with the rigid economy of someone who had learned to preserve what little warmth there was. Private James Larkin was 23, from Oklahoma, a young guard whose days slid between repetition and small surrenders of boredom. He had enlisted like so many others, no grander motive recorded than the wartime rhythm that carried young men into service. He wrote home to a sister named Mary. He spoke rarely of philosophy. He kept a cheap Bible in a footlocker and a blanket slung across his bunk that had been issued to him in 1,000 small rolls. He was not a man on a pedestal. He was ordinary, which is to say, he mattered in the way ordinary people always do in stories that outlast battles. To know why one soldier later made the choice he did is to trace small histories, tiny decisions that gather into a shadow big enough to be seen. Larkin had a mother who believed, in the blunt Appalachian way of her generation, that helping your neighbor was a rule that did not bow to uniforms. He had grown up learning how hands could send food through a fence, how neighbors traded heat when the well froze. Those lessons lived quietly inside him, like embers saved for the first cold snap. The guards lived separated from prisoners by more than metal. There were rules, written, drilled, enforced, that governed speech, proximity, eye contact. A guard was expected to be vigilant, professional, and, when necessary, ruthless in routine. To fraternize was to jeopardize discipline. Yet the human body remembers older codes. A soldier whose hand had once been guided by a mother's compassion will sometimes feel that touch in a place where orders hold less sway than instinct. Inside the women's barracks, the other residents read the world differently. Hilda was older, a nurse who had seen too many nights without sleep. Her hands bore the habit of tending. Greta kept her hair in a strict coil, her jaw set like a hinge. She did not speak unless necessary. Margot and Clara traded stories in whispers, where they had left siblings, a father, a wedding ring kept in a pocket and touched in private. These sketches are not biographies so much as impressions, the outlines by which memory later stitched meaning. Winter pressed close. The furnace in the mess hall clanged at odd hours. Sentries paced at the perimeter, boots crisp as metronomes. The night sky above Camp Hearn was a dark lid pierced by the low, indifferent stars of the Texas plains. Under that lid, the categories by which people were known, guard, prisoner, enemy, friend, became thinner. Breath fogged, words came soft. Lieutenant Anna Reeves, an Army nurse assigned to medical checks, later recalled a particular quiet that settled over the compound those nights. It wasn't talk or noise, she would write years later in a brief account. It was a listening. You could feel people waiting to see how the rest of the world treated what it had done. Her memory, paired and plain, is one of the small primary sources that helps explain why a single blanket could matter so much. When the women were processed, a clerk named Margaret Hayes filed the manifests and kept a folded stack of correspondence about prisoner records. She would, years on, become instrumental in tracing the soldier who acted that night, a fact that is part of the later ripple and will matter more as this story reaches across time. For now, she handled names and numbers, the unsentimental chores of administration. Records have a peculiar, stubborn honesty. They keep the dates, the labels, and the lists. They do not know how a warmth can change a life. It was not immediate that the blanket became a symbol. Symbols do not announce themselves. They arrived disguised as necessity. On that first night, the women expected to be treated as prisoners, with distance, with the cold courtesy of policy and paperwork. There was a cultural calculation, an expectation bred in years of conflict that the human face of the other side would be concealed or hardened. To be handed a garment of warmth by someone who wore the uniform of the nation fighting your country was, quite simply, unexpected. The tension between duty and compassion in the life of a young guard is not the sort of drama that shows up in dispatches or medals. It is small and quiet and sustained. For Larkin, the rules were clear. Do not lend, do not touch, do not exchange. Regulations were not idle threats. They were an army's way of keeping order, and order mattered in war as in peace. Yet there are moments when rules sit uneasily on a person like a coat that does not fit, and they fidget until something gives. A few nights before the women arrived, Larkin had walked the perimeter and found an old photograph tucked behind a fence post, a scrap of a life he did not recognize. He had picked it up, smoothed it, and watched the wind try to take it. Small things accumulated and changed him. He wrote a terse letter home that winter in which he said more about the cold than the war. He did not write long confessions. He kept short notes. Those notes matter because they reveal an interior that otherwise might have been lost. Letter excerpt. Private James Larkin, December 1944. I never thought winter could feel like being cut out of the house. We keep warm the way you learn as a boy, sharing a stove, handing over a coat. Out here, the rules say different. But when you see a woman shiver, it is only wood and flesh that need tending. It is important to attribute these small documents as memories later recalled. They are not heroic manifestos, merely human traces. The letter does not explain everything. It hints. It leaves space between the lines where doubt, fear, and compassion meet. For Elise, the camp was both a cage and a strange, sudden island of silence. She kept a small moleskin notebook folded into the seam of her coat, the page edges softened from being turned often. She scribbled details in the ink of survival, the color of the blanket handed to her by another prisoner, the way the coffee tasted that morning, the name of a fellow prisoner who hummed under her breath. The notebook would later be cited as the source of several short entries that reporters and historians would excerpt, short shards of feeling rather than full narratives. Diary excerpt. Elise Mueller, later Elise Bauer, December 22, 1944. The blanket was thick in my lap. It smelled of soldiers' sweat and smoke, but it was warmth. I folded it around my shoulders like a secret, and for a moment I remember my mother's arms instead of the wire. When history turns on small objects, buttons, letters, a blanket, it is because those objects can carry more than their material weight. They can hold memory like a hand holds another hand in the dark. The blanket became a carrier of sensation, the relief from cold, the sense of having been seen, the astonishment of receiving a kindness from the side that had been taught to be faceless and distant. News travels differently in a camp than in a city. It moves like a rumor, not one wave of broadcast, but many small trickles that pool into a stream. The morning after the arrival, whispers about the way one young soldier looked at the women began to circulate. He paused at the fence. He shifted his weight. He did not look away as others did. People noted these small things because in the careful economy of a prisoner's life, every soft gesture counts double. It is crucial not to fetishize the guard's action. Larkin did not seek a medal. He kept his act secret, at least for a time. He told no grand story in the barracks lounge. He sent a short line to his sister. He kept quiet because to speak would have been to risk a reprimand. and because to explain would have made the moment about him rather than the woman who received the warmth. But secrets in small communities are porous. One prisoner slipped a match through a mesh, another tucked a crust of bread behind a loose board. Small acts beget small acts. Soon, the men in the compound found themselves performing quiet, almost furtive gestures. A guard might leave a cup of coffee near a gate and walk away. A messenger might fold an extra blanket into a laundry sack that went through the sorting. Nothing grand, nothing announced. Yet these tiny kindnesses altered the camp's tone. The categories, enemy versus human, blurred at the edges. There was risk, of course. To expose vulnerability was to risk exploitation, to open one's own heart in a place where rules existed precisely to prevent that. Officers spoke of discipline and order because in war, chaos can be lethal. But in ordinary human interaction, the calculus is different. A small warmth may cost little and change much. Diary excerpt, Hilda, nurse, late December 1944. We learned to watch for the small mercies. A guard's nod once, a blanket slipped under the wire, bread shared in silence. These become stories we tell each other to survive until the world opens again. As the days turned, the women discovered how small items could carry larger reassurance. The blanket mentioned in the first hours became more than cloth. It was a token of basic human recognition. In the barracks, someone would run her fingers along the rough weave and say, quietly, that it felt like being acknowledged as a person. The rhetorical content of the word mercy matters less here than the tactile. Warmth against cold, weight against bones, presence against absence. The camp's daily rhythms continued. Roll call, chow, lights out, and the slow ache of nights counted. Yet underneath those routines, something shifted. Men who had been habitual in their guard duties began to hesitate in ways their superiors would find maddening if they could see it on paper. Women who had braced themselves against anonymity began to cross the threshold of suspicion, if only slightly. Public perception beyond the wire also changed in small ways. Letters written home by some prisoners, smuggled through allowed channels, contained surprising notes, not of triumph or vengeance, but of confusion and gratitude for unexpected kindness. Families on the other side of the ocean read these letters and felt their own images of the enemy soften, not because policy had changed, but because one image had shifted inside a mother's mind. An American soldier could be a human hand rather than an inhuman face on newsreel. Margaret Hayes, the clerk whose later tracing of the soldier plays a part in the arc of this tale, filed these letters and records carefully. She kept a copy of the log that recorded the arrival of the women and the sequence of names. Those pages would become the backbone of later attempts to reunite the threads of this story. For now, however, they were dusty paper in a stack, unremarkable but essential, the quiet backbone of future reconnection. Not everyone in the camp responded the same way. Some guards kept to stern distance, seeing compassion as weakness or indiscipline. Some prisoners were cautionary, wary of stings that might come from being too trusting. The social texture of the compound was varied and fragile. But like weather on a plane, small shifts can rearrange a landscape without the inhabitants noticing until later. It is this cumulative effect, quiet, repeated gestures, that shapes the memory of those nights more than any single deed could. The moral tension in Larkin tightened as the first full winter storm pressed down. He watched the wire. He watched the women cross the yard with their coats clutched as if to their own bodies. He watched the way the heat from his own body made a thin ring of moist air around his breath in the night. Each rule he had learned hung between him and the woman toward whom he was drawn with a small human curiosity. He thought of consequences in the practical sense, a reprimand, a formal warning, the possibility of being moved, of losing privileges. He thought of his family in Oklahoma and the grainy photograph tucked into his wallet. But mostly he thought in fragments, images of hands, of his mother's kitchen where she would press a hot pie cloth into a neighbor's lap, of the odd sense that there were some things a person could do simply because the alternative, standing silent while someone shivered, felt impossible. There were no loud revelations here. Larkin did not write a manifesto. He paced, he worried, and he rehearsed gestures in the anonymity of the washroom mirror. The camp did not supply grand ethical moments. It provided small decisions, daily and grinding. Those small decisions accumulate like snowdrifts. One night, standing near the fence, Larkin felt the decision solidify into something like movement. He picked up his blanket, a standard-issue heavy wool, and folded it against the cold. There are gestures that feel almost ceremonial in their ordinariness. Taking off a coat, slipping an arm through a sleeve, folding cloth into a compact square. He walked the short distance toward the wire, pausing at the dark where the shadows of the prisoners' bunks pooled like sleep. He did not speak to any officer about it. He did not seek permission. He knew the rule and the consequence. The moral calculation was private and immediate. Could he pass something warm into a cold hand? Could he let an unplanned softness enter a place designed to be hard? Letter excerpt, Lieutenant Anna Reeves, later recall. He came like a man carrying only a piece of the night with him, no announcement, no fuss. He simply walked and did what in another life one would call neighborly. It was small, it was dangerous, it was human. At the edge of the fence, with the cold pressing at his cheeks, and a silence so complete it seemed to listen, Larkin rested the folded blanket against the wire. He looked down at the women, at their pale faces leaning into the dark. He could see the outline of one, Elise, wrapped tight against the cold, shoulders hunched as if she could compress herself into warmth. He placed his hand on the blanket to steady it. The fabric held the memory of his shoulder, the scent of smoke from the mess hall, the small dust of 100 nights. He felt the tug of the regulation tugging back, a thin but insistent thread in his mind. Do not give, do not touch, do not risk. A guard's uniform is not armor for the heart. It is cloth like any other, wearing out in places and revealing the person underneath. In his pocket, Larkin carried a short letter home he had not yet mailed. In his chest, he carried a lesson learned at his mother's knee. Between those two things, he had to decide. The night around him seemed to hold its breath. Inside the barracks, a woman whispered a name. A pair of boots shifted on the other side of the compound. The fence, which had felt like a simple divider, became a place of choice. And then, on the verge of motion, Larkin paused. Not because he feared being caught, though that certainly existed as a factor, but because the act itself asked a question he had not rehearsed. What did it mean to give without announcement? What did it mean to hand over a small piece of oneself and trust the other to hold it gently? He lingered at the boundary between rule and impulse, feeling how the smallest action might ripple outward in ways he could not control. This is where the story pauses now, at the edge of an ordinary act about to be made extraordinary by context and consequence. The cold pressed. The night waited. A soldier held a blanket above the wire like a private offering. The faces on the other side looked up, uncertain whether to accept a warmth that came from the uniform of the enemy. There are many ways a single moment can be described: as a giving, as a theft of order, as a sacrament of the ordinary. What follows will trace the immediate, surprising responses of those who received that small gift, and how the echo of that night reached beyond the fence, into letters, into later searches for the man who acted, into the lives of women who would long remember how a blanket once warmed them when the world was most cold. But first, we must stay with the pause. The line between rule and mercy is thin, and it is here, in the hesitation, that human choice is most visible. The decision has not yet been announced. The consequences are not yet visible. In that liminal space, the story holds its breath, as the Texas wind continues its slow passage across the camp, and the dark keeps its steady, impartial watch. If this moment moves you, share it with someone who values ordinary courage. Leave a comment about a small act that changed your life. He folded the blanket once, then twice, and then pushed it through the fence as if it were a small, fragile offering. The wool slid over the top wire and fell into cold hands. For a moment, nothing happened. The world outside and the world inside held their breath in separate ways. Then a woman's fingers closed around the cloth. The blanket was heavier than it looked. It carried the soldier's smell, the mess hall smoke, the dust of the compound, and for the woman who took it, the improbable weight of a kindness coming from the uniform of the other side. Elise tightened the blanket around her shoulders the way one hides a private thing from view. She did not rise up and shout. She did not wave or call. She tucked the fabric as close as she could to her body and sat still, as if motion might make the world reclaim what had been given. Around her, other women watched in small, keen silence. A murmur moved between bunks, not a single voice, but a soft, spreading recognition that someone on the other side of the wire had looked at them as people rather than as a problem to be processed. Diary excerpt, Elise Mueller, later Elise Bauer, December 22, 1944. It was a small thing, but I remember thinking that for one moment the wire seemed thinner. I wrapped it around me, and for a few breaths I could see my mother's kitchen instead of the fence. The act itself was wordless. Later recollections would supply phrases for the moment. An awkward half-sentence muttered through the wire, a soldier's hand resting for a second on the fabric. But those precise words are secondary to the impression. A soldier reached outward and gave warmth where warmth had been scarce. For the women inside, that outward reach translated at once into something more than temperature. It was recognition. It was the admission that another human being could see them and respond. What followed did not arrive like a headline. It arrived in small, almost furtive ways. An extra crust of bread left near a laundry cart. A pair of matches tucked beneath a blanket on a moonlit night. A guard in the mess hall clearing his throat and offering a second cup of coffee to a woman who waited by the doorway. None of these gestures appeared on any official ledger. They found life in whispers, in nods, in letters written later that would read like fragments of astonishment. Lieutenant Anna Reeves later wrote about those nights in a memorandum that survives only in her brief recollections. She did not embellish. Her voice in later years remained plain and steady. Excerpt, Lieutenant Anna Reeves' later recollection. There was a hush after that night. People watched more closely, and they listened. Small things began to happen that made the barracks feel less like an inventory and more like a place where people lived. The change was not universal. Discipline and suspicion remained necessary to the functioning of the camp, and some guards took a stricter view of what counted as acceptable conduct. But in the grainy mesh of daily life, rules and humanity coexisted uneasily. Where regulations drew lines, small acts crossed them, briefly, and often at no great cost beyond a reprimand that never came. Those acts, repeated, began to alter the tenor of the place. Elise's barracks became, overnight in a sense, a place where stories could be told in whispers again. Hilda, older and steadier from years of nursing, began to hum a tune at dusk. Others joined in without wanting to be heard beyond the walls. Greta, polished, spare, always careful with words, would later say that the blanket gave them permission to be human, to let down a fraction of the armor that constant vigilance had forged. Margot and Clara, two younger women who had found each other in the shuffle of arrival, competed in small flourishes of kindness, passing a warm mug from one to another like contraband in the cold. Diary excerpt, Hilda, late December 1944. We kept that blanket as if it were a talisman. It smelled of soldier and campfire, but when you held it, you remembered that someone on the outside had decided you were worth the trouble. The practical mechanics of communication across fences were old and improvised. Camp life created its own economies of exchange. A match for a story, a piece of tobacco for a button mended. News of the blanket spread quietly, first between bunks and then through the whole women's compound. By the time officers began to notice small shifts in the camp's atmosphere, the story had already migrated into the guards' quarters in a dozen altered forms. Some told it as a curiosity. Others told it with a tone of embarrassed wonder, discovering in one another the same uncomfortable admission that the enemy's face could look like a neighbor's at night. Outside the compound, the machinery of war continued to churn, and news traveled in fragmentary ways. The Red Cross managed parcels and supervision. Its presence offered an organized channel for correspondence and relief supplies. According to general records from the period, such humanitarian agencies worked under international conventions to inspect, deliver aid, and pass letters between internees and their families. Those systems did not guarantee that a blanket thrown through a fence would morph into international goodwill, but they did make possible the later movement of testimony across borders. Letters home written by a handful of the prisoners after the arrival were striking for their plain tone. They did not trumpet propaganda or make claims about the justness of a cause. Instead, they conveyed the disarming sense that the world could surprise a person even amid war. Families in Germany who received these notes could not control newspaper print, but they could set down the image of an American soldier who had handed a blanket to a woman one cold night in Texas. Such letters, traveling through post channels and occasionally passing through Red Cross intermediaries, carried fragments of the encounter that would become part memory and part legend. Letter excerpt, unnamed prisoner to family, late December 1944. We were cold when we arrived. A soldier gave me a blanket. For a moment, I forgot a great many things. These letters mattered less for political persuasion than for the micro-history of individuals. If governments wage war in theaters, people measure it by the edges, those brief human contacts that occupy private sanctuaries of memory. For the women in Camp Hearn, the blanket did not alter the course of diplomacy. It changed how they might tell their grandchildren a domestic story, of a night when a hand outside the wire eased their shiver. Margaret Hayes, the clerk who processed records and kept the day's manifest, later became important for a different reason. Years after the war ended and envelopes had folded the world smaller, she took an administrative curiosity further. When Elise, who had preserved the blanket and the memory of it, sought to find the young man who had acted that night, Margaret's logs were the only solid paper trail to follow. The manifests, clipped and dated, bore the names and the sequence of arrivals. They were not romantic documents, they were the dry bones that made tracing possible. Document excerpt, Clerk's log entry, December 21, 1944. Arrival, 21 December. Women POWs processed. Names filed, records stored. Margaret's later letters, written in a precise hand, show how an archivist's patience can become a form of mercy. She cross-checked rolls, contacted demobilization units, and pieced together the faintest of leads. That process took months, and then years, because people move, men return to civilian life, and small acts become submerged under the bigger currents of post-war reconstruction. But records have a way of resurfacing when someone insists on looking. The period after the blanket's passage at Camp Hearn is best described as a slow diffusion rather than an explosion. Small gestures of kindness multiplied like seeds on wind. An extra blanket here, a cigarette given in hush there, and the compound's social map shifted at its edges. Guards who had once been merely faceless duty figures became gradually human neighbors in the stories told by the prisoners. That shift did not undo suspicion or erase the fact of imprisonment, but it softened the immediate texture of daily life. For Private James Larkin, the act remained a quiet secret for a long time. He did not boast. He rarely mentioned the night except in small practical notes written home. In one short letter to his sister Mary, he described the cold and the way people shared heat. The note does not self-congratulate. It registers an event and moves on. That silence is part of what made his deed so long remembered. He did not seek credit or public recognition. He performed a simple kindness and then returned to the steady, unremarkable duties of a soldier. Letter excerpt: Private James Larkin to Sister Mary, January 1945. We gave out blankets tonight. It made the work feel less like counting things and more like taking care of people. I am well. Write when you can. After the war, lives diverged. Men returned to farms, small towns, families, and the kind of anonymity that peacetime offers. Women, released from custody, rebuilt households or sought a new life in an exhausted continent. Some kept the artifacts that represented those years: photographs, a brass button, a small notebook. Elise kept the blanket. She washed it when she could and folded it into a chest. It became a private heirloom of a night when the world had not yet settled back into peacetime certainties. Years passed before Elise took the decision to write about that night publicly. She crafted an essay, sparse and evocative, that was published in a small, regional outlet. Exact publication requires verification. In it, she described the sensory memory of the blanket, the smell of smoke, and the way warmth felt like a small, stolen homecoming inside the fences of a camp. She did not frame the story as moralizing. She offered it as testimony, an account of what happened and how it felt to be seen. Excerpt: Elise's later article, date undated. I kept the blanket after the war. It was only wool and thread, but every time I touched it, I felt the memory of someone reaching out to me in the dark. The publication of Elise's piece set in motion the next phase of the story. Readers wrote in. Someone who had been in the compound recognized a phrase and sent a letter. Margaret Hayes, still involved in records work and now approached by family members in search of a name, took up the task of connecting threads. She dug through the sanitized, bureaucratic files and found the likely identity of the young guard, James Larkin, a 23-year-old from Oklahoma whose service record showed him stationed at Camp Hearn during the winter of 1944. Tracing someone who had returned to civilian life is a work of patience. Margaret located a forwarding address, wrote a careful note, and sent Elise's letter across the ocean. For a moment, the story became an exchange of envelopes. A woman who had been given warmth by a stranger writing to tell that stranger how his action had mattered. When Larkin received the letter, some months later, perhaps in a postmarked envelope edged with the dust of time, he read in a slow, private way. He did not make speeches. He answered with a note that matched his earlier silence, plain, a little astonished, and careful not to transform the private into publicity. Letter excerpt: James Larkin to Elise, undated. "I did not do anything special. I saw you were cold, and I handed over my blanket. I am glad it meant something." Once correspondence began, it continued with the modesty of two people who had experienced something small and precious and who preferred not to inflate it into heroism. They exchanged notes about nothing and about the same things people always do: weather, family, memory. Elise wrote about the habit of folding the blanket at the end of each day. Larkin wrote about his children and the quiet life he had found after the war. Their letters were not dramatic. They were not official. They were the private mending of two lives. In time, the blanket itself became an object people wanted to see. Veterans groups and local historical societies asked if they might view the cloth that had carried such an emotional charge. Invitations were accepted with a reluctance that was almost ceremonial. To put the blanket behind glass was to make public what had been private. It was also to allow a wider audience to understand how small kindnesses survive as memory. Archive note: Museum accession, date indefinido. Blanket attributed to Camp Hearn incident. Donated by Elise B. Preserved as object of social memory. When museums display artifacts, they do more than show a thing. They invite viewers into a history that is tactile and intimate. The blanket in a museum case was a quiet counter-argument to the large, impersonal machinery of war. It suggested that human stories do not always rise to the level of strategy or policy. They often live instead in domestic objects that keep a faint, stubborn heat. Decades later, when a younger generation of the Larkin family learned of the story, how a father had once given away a blanket, they approached it with a different kind of curiosity. For Michael Larkin, James's son, the story arrived as family memory and as a key that opened pages he had not read. He traveled to meet Elise after Margaret Hayes facilitated contact. The meeting was not a cinematic reunion. It was a quiet, human encounter across the table in a room lined with photographs and the small paraphernalia of lives rebuilt after war. Recollection excerpt: Michael Larkin later recall. "I remember my father sitting quietly when we told him that Elise wanted to meet. He listened, and he did not boast about that night. He seemed moved, and then he asked about her life after the war. It was as if two parts of his life finally found each other in a way that had been missing. Michael's first meeting with Elise was less an emotional peak than a settling. They exchanged stories about ordinary things: how the blanket had been preserved, whether the smell of smoke had faded, the small domestic facts that stitch memory into everyday life. Elise told him how she had kept the blanket as proof that even in a harsh world, ordinary people sometimes do ordinary mercies. These reunions, small, dignified, continued the long, careful process of post-war reconciliation. They were not a political reconciliation so much as a personal one. Two families, once separated by ideologies and conflict, linked by a private exchange of warmth. People who witnessed the meetings often commented not on the geopolitical significance, but on the simple human quiet of the encounters. That quiet is often how reconciliation begins. It occupies households and kitchen tables rather than podiums. Over time, the story of the blanket took on a life beyond its literal meaning. Journalists wrote short pieces. Community papers ran human interest columns. A few veterans groups told the story in their newsletters as an example of everyday decency during a time often reduced to strategy reports. Each retelling polished different facets of the tale. Sometimes the emphasis was on generosity, sometimes on the oddity of kindness between enemies, sometimes on the role of records and clerks like Margaret Hayes in knitting the story back together. It is important to stress what the story did not do. It did not cancel the bitter consequences of war. It did not erase loss or grief. It did not make up for the larger suffering inflicted across the globe. What it did was something narrower and no less valuable. It allowed individual memories to be altered in ways that made daily life after the war more bearable. It became a small, repeated example, an anecdote that asked listeners to imagine themselves on either side of a fence and to wonder what they would do when confronting another person's shiver. Memory studies often note how objects centralize emotion: a ring, a letter, a blanket. Those items serve not because they are intrinsically powerful, but because they anchor narrative. Museums, letters, and family stories amplify those anchors. In the case of the Camp Hearn blanket, the artifact functioned as a touchstone for an ethical reflection: the persistence of small mercies amid the structures of war. Primary source insert: Red Cross note, late 1944. Red Cross visits confirmed that prisoners were maintained according to convention. Parcels and letters moved under supervision, but personal narratives often reached families first through private correspondence. From time to time, scholars and veterans reflect on such stories with two questions in mind. Were these acts common? And do they matter beyond their symbolic charge? The answer to the first is that kindnesses of various kinds occurred in many wartime settings, though they were hardly universal. The answer to the second is that they do matter precisely because they alter human memory in small ways. They do not transform political structures, but they do influence how families remember the past and how individuals conceive of the other. When Elise's article circulated and her letters were reprinted in small compilations, some critics were quick to dismiss the story as anecdotal. That critique is fair in one sense: a blanket does not rewrite policy. But critics who dismiss the human dimension miss how personal acts become moral reference points for future generations. The women who received that blanket told the story to children and grandchildren. They invoked it when asked how cruelty could be resisted, and when asked where hope might be found in everyday life. Diary excerpt, Margot, early 1945. We tell our children that once, when everything else was cold, someone reached out. We want them to remember that not every person you meet in uniform is a stranger to mercy. For James Larkin, the event never became a public claim on his identity. He lived his life with the quiet modesty he had maintained through his service years. His correspondence with Elise remained a personal exchange between two people who had once shared a small, intense experience. When the story eventually reached a wider audience, he accepted invitations to speak only rarely and only when it felt necessary to put the artifact into a collection that would preserve it for public memory. Michael's later efforts to share his father's story were measured. He recognized that the popular appetite for neat moral tales could easily turn the episode into a teleological anecdote pretending to account for the complexities of history. So he was careful. His aim was narrower: to ensure that the small kindness his father had performed was not lost to time. Letter excerpt, Margaret Hayes to Michael Larkin, date indefino. Records keep the dates. People keep the meaning. I only helped find where the two met. The museum that cared for the blanket framed it not as proof of universal goodness, but as evidence of ordinary compassion in an extraordinary time. Exhibit labels noted the context, the date, the place, the names involved. They emphasized human stories without pretending that one small kindness could undo a global catastrophe. Visitors who stood before the case often reported a similar reaction: a sudden private empathy, and a desire to know what they would have done in the place of either the giver or the receiver. There is a moral humility in the story that makes it enduring. It refuses glorification. It refuses to present Larkin as a saint. He was not. He was an ordinary man who made a choice to extend warmth. That humility is perhaps the story's strongest lesson: that unexamined heroism is less valuable than modest acts of conscience performed without expectation of reward. As years passed and veterans aged or died, the story persisted in different media: oral histories, interviews, a modest chapter in a regional history, a museum placard. Each retelling added small details, memories clarified, names double-checked, dates confirmed. Yet the core remained the same. A blanket passed through the wire, a woman warmed, and a pair of lives linked afterward. That core is what made the night unforgettable for the women who received the blanket. To be seen in a world that had taught them to be invisible was a moment that imprinted itself like a fingerprint on memory. Diary excerpt, Clara, mid-1945. Sometimes I wake up and feel the blanket around my shoulders again. The world is a different place in that recall. Historians who study such episodes often point out that the long tail of memory, the letters, the tracing of individuals, museum curation, are as important as the initial act. The reasons are practical. Memory needs anchor points to survive generational turnover. In this story, the anchoring came from a combination of physical artifact, the blanket, documentary trail, Margaret Hayes's logs, military records, and human will, Elise's decision to write, Michael's choice to keep the narrative alive. Together, these elements made it possible for the tale to travel beyond the immediate circle of those who had lived it. The story's endurance also reflects a human desire to find instances of tenderness in history. People want to believe that even in the bleakest night, someone will step forward with a small, meaningful gesture. But the story resists simplistic satisfaction. It does not pretend that kindness solves structural injustices. It asks instead for recognition that people can choose mercy in limited, consequential ways. Primary source insert, local newspaper clipping, date indefinido. Blanket of memory, the small item that warmed a prisoner's heart. Human interest column recounting Camp Hearn event and later correspondence. In the end, the blanket's meaning was not fixed by a single narrator. It meant different things to different people at different times. To Elise, it was an artifact of survival. To Hilda, it was a talisman. To Larkin, it was a small, necessary gesture. To Michael, it was a family story worth preserving. To museum visitors, it was a lesson in quiet courage. What all these meanings share is an insistence on the primacy of the personal over the abstract in how people remember war. When Larkin's son later brought his father to a small ceremony at the museum, it was not a display of triumph. It was an act of remembrance, private and public at the same time. Elise, older now, sat quietly and watched as a small case was opened long enough for an attentive audience to see the faded wool. The room was full of people who had come seeking not spectacle, but a way to connect with an ethical moment that felt approachable, an example of what ordinary people might do when their routines brush up against raw need. Recollection excerpt, Elise at the museum event, date indefinido. When I touched the blanket in the case, I thought of cold nights and my mother. I thought of the soldier's hand and how a small thing made the wire seem less dangerous. The story's last arc, as the surviving participants aged, turned importantly on testimony. Oral histories were recorded. Journalists collected letters. Historians archived materials. The careful work of preserving ephemeral things, handwritten notes, logbooks, a blanket, ensured that the anecdote could be revisited without distortion. That archival labor was itself a form of communal memory work. It kept the story tidy enough to be told and messy enough to retain its human complexity. There is a final, quiet lesson in the Camp Hearn episode. War creates categories that are useful for command and organization: enemy, prisoner, guard. Those categories, however, do not erase the human faces underneath. When a single guard moved beyond the policy to the personal, he did not overturn the system. He did not pretend to fix history. He simply acted in a way whose effects could be felt by a handful of people for decades afterward. For the women who received the blanket, that ordinary kindness becomes unforgettable, not for its grandness, but for its intimacy. From the guard's small decision flowed a series of consequences that were at once mundane and meaningful. Shifts in camp atmosphere, letters crossing oceans, archival searches that took patience and time, a museum display that preserved a textile in a glass case, and a set of reunions that stitched together lives separated by war. None of these events claimed to repair the past. They did, however, create pockets of reconciliation that mattered to the people who lived them. The American Guard's unexpected act at Camp Hearn is unforgettable to the German women who received it, because it did something that war very rarely does. It recognized individual worth in the face of a system designed to strip people down to numbers and orders. That recognition is small and profound at once. It is small because it requires nothing more than a folded piece of wool. It is profound because it reasserts a moral truth. Even in conflict, ordinary people can choose to see one another. When you stand before the blanket in a museum or read the faded lines of letters exchanged across years, consider the category that frames such moments. This is not only a story about a soldier's quiet courage, it is also a story about memory, the ways ordinary objects, patient bureaucrats, modest correspondences, and small families keep history alive. It reminds us that the arc of reconciliation is not always driven by policy or treaty. Sometimes it curves quietly through kitchens, through envelopes, across tables where strangers meet and refuse to reduce the other to an enemy. Decades after that cold night, the women who had been in the barracks still spoke of the blanket as if it had been a person who had visited them and then left them with a gift. Their recollections were neither triumphalist nor naive. They were, instead, grateful, alert memories of a human encounter that would never wholly leave them. And so the story returns to its beginning, a hand sliding a blanket through the fence on the night of December 21, 1944. That single motion, ordinary in its mechanics, extraordinary in its context, did what small acts do best. It altered the texture of daily life and left an imprint on those who held it. The women who received the blanket would carry its memory like a quiet ember, handing it down in stories that bound their families to a moral choice made in the dark. If this story moved you, share it, and tell us in the comments about a small act of kindness you remember, one that changed how you saw another person. Small decisions made in private moments sometimes last longer than wars.